Saxony, Germany, July 1945. The war in Europe had ended just weeks ago, but for thousands caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, the nightmare was far from over. The United States Army occupied territories deep in what had been agreed would become the Soviet zone of control. Small towns, villages, entire regions that had welcomed American liberators now faced a terrifying reality. The Americans were leaving, and the Red Army was coming to take their place. In a makeshift field hospital in a Saxon town whose name would be lost to history, Sergeant Ellsworth Thatcher moved through corridors that smelled of disinfectant and desperation. At 28 years old, Ellis had seen enough of war to last several lifetimes. He had landed at Normandy, pushed through the hedgerows of France, crossed the Rhine, and helped liberate concentration camps that revealed horrors beyond human comprehension. He thought he had seen the worst humanity could offer. He was wrong. The hospital had been established in what was once a schoolhouse. Its walls still bore faded educational posters in German, now covered with medical charts and supply lists. Wounded soldiers, both American and German, lay in rows of cots. Civilians injured in the final chaotic days of combat filled another wing, and moving between them all, with efficiency and quiet grace, was Liesl Brenner. Liesl was 24, though the war had aged her beyond those years. She had trained as a nurse before the conflict consumed everything, working first in Berlin hospitals as the bombing intensified, then closer to the front lines as Germany's collapse became inevitable. She had seen the Reich's propaganda machine crumble into dust. She had treated dying boys who still believed in victory, even as Soviet shells fell around them. And when the Americans arrived, she had made a choice that many of her countrymen considered treason. She stayed. She helped. She worked alongside the enemy because she believed that healing transcended politics and nationality. Ellis first noticed her 3 weeks after his unit occupied the town. She was changing the dressing on a young German soldier's leg wound, speaking softly to him in their shared language, calming him as he whimpered in pain. There was something in the way she moved, the gentleness combined with absolute competence, that caught his attention. Over the following days, as his duties brought him regularly to the hospital, they began to exchange words. Her English was rough but functional. His German was limited to commands and basic phrases. Yet somehow they communicated. They talked during her brief breaks, sitting on the stone steps outside the hospital as summer heat made the building's interior unbearable. She told him about her family. Her father had been a teacher, executed by the Gestapo in 1943 for speaking against the regime. Her mother died in a bombing raid on Dresden. Her younger brother was missing, last seen retreating with what remained of the Wehrmacht toward Berlin. She was alone in the world, defined only by her work and her determination to help anyone who needed it, regardless of the uniform they wore or the flag they had followed. Ellis shared pieces of his own story. A farm in Iowa, parents who worried constantly, writing letters that took weeks to arrive and were read until the paper wore thin. A younger sister who sent him packages of cookies that arrived as crumbs but tasted like home. Dreams of returning, of normal life, of forgetting the things he had witnessed. But as the days passed and their conversations deepened, Ellis began to realize that his dreams of home were becoming complicated by the presence of this German nurse, who smiled rarely but genuinely, whose hand saved lives with the same dedication whether those lives wore olive drab or field gray. Then came the order that changed everything. Captain Horace Dunbar assembled the unit's leadership on June 27th. The captain was a career officer, 42 years old, with a face carved from granite and a reputation for absolute adherence to military protocol. He stood before a map of the region, pointer in hand, and delivered the news with the emotion of a man reading a supply manifest. The Yalta and Potsdam agreements had divided Germany into occupation zones. Due to the rapid American advance in the war's final weeks, U.S. forces currently held territory that belonged to the Soviet zone. Orders from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force were clear and non-negotiable. All American units would withdraw from Soviet-designated territories by specific dates and times. Their sector's withdrawal was scheduled for July 1st at 0600 hours. Soviet forces would cross the demarcation line at 0615. The transition would be orderly, complete, and absolute. Ellis felt his stomach drop. He knew what this meant. Everyone in the room knew what this meant. They had all heard the reports filtering back from the East. The Red Army's treatment of German civilians, particularly women, was the subject of whispered conversations and official silence. Rape, brutality, revenge for what the Wehrmacht had done to Russia. The stories were horrific, and every indication suggested they were true. After the briefing, Ellis found Chaplain Amos Whitmore sitting alone in what had been the school's library, now converted into a makeshift chapel. The chaplain was 51, old for a combat posting, with silver hair and eyes that had seen too many young men die. He held a Bible but wasn't reading it, just staring at the wall. "They're condemning them," Whitmore said without preamble. "Every woman, every girl in this town. We're leaving them to hell, and we're doing it because politicians drew lines on a map." Ellis sat down beside him. "Is there anything we can do?" "Pray," Whitmore said bitterly. "That's what I'm supposed to say, isn't it? Pray and trust in God's plan. But I'm having a hard time seeing the divine wisdom in abandoning innocent people to brutality, because it's politically convenient." They sat in silence, both wrestling with the impossible situation. Outside, the sounds of preparation had already begun. Trucks being loaded, equipment being packed, the systematic dismantling of the American presence. Word spread through the town with the speed of panic. By the evening of June 27th, the local population knew the Americans were leaving and the Soviets were coming. The reaction was immediate and desperate. Women began seeking any possible protection. Some tried to find relatives in the western zones. Others hid valuables and prepared to barricade themselves in their homes. And some sought the only protection they thought might work: marriage to an American soldier. The fraternization policy was clear and ruthlessly enforced. Relationships between American servicemen and German civilians, particularly women, were strictly forbidden. Marriage required extensive paperwork, background checks, approval from multiple levels of command, and typically took months to process. It was designed specifically to prevent soldiers from making impulsive decisions. But policy and paperwork meant nothing to women facing the Red Army's arrival. Ellis saw Liesel on the evening of June 28th. She was finishing her shift at the hospital, moving through the ward with her usual efficiency, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was watching. He waited until she stepped outside into the long shadows of the summer evening. "Liesel." She turned, and he saw fear in her eyes for the first time since he had known her. Real, undisguised fear. "It's true?" she asked. "You're leaving?" "July 1st, morning. Orders are absolute." She nodded slowly, looking down at her hands. They were clean now, scrubbed after hours of work, but he could see the wear on them, the evidence of countless patients cared for, countless lives touched. "They will kill me," she said quietly. "Not immediately, perhaps, but I have worked with Americans. I have helped you. I have refused to see you as enemies. The Soviets will view me as a collaborator, a traitor to the socialist cause. And even if they don't, I am a woman alone in a town about to be occupied by an army that has been taught to hate us." Ellis felt something break inside his chest. "There has to be something." "There is," she said, meeting his eyes. "But it requires you to risk everything." That night Ellis couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk in the requisitioned house where his unit was quartered, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Liesel's words. He knew what she was suggesting without her having to say it explicitly. Marriage, a war bride. It was the only status that might protect her, that might allow her to board the convoy heading west. But the risks were catastrophic. Marrying without authorization was a court-martial offense. He could lose his rank, his honorable discharge, face military prison. Everything he had survived, all the battles and horrors, could end not with glory, but with disgrace. His family would be shamed, his future would be destroyed. He thought about his parents on their Iowa farm. His father, a man of few words and absolute principles, who had taught him that a soldier followed orders and did his duty. His mother, who prayed for him every night and dreamed of him coming home to marry a nice local girl and give her grandchildren. What would they think if he threw away everything for a German woman he had known for less than a month? But then he thought about Liesel's hands, gentle and competent, treating wounded men with equal care regardless of which side they had fought for. He thought about her quiet courage, her refusal to hate, her choice to heal in a world that seemed determined to destroy. And he thought about what would happen to her when the Red Army arrived. By morning, he had made his decision. June 29th dawned hot and cloudless. The town was in chaos. Civilians packed belongings, though there was nowhere to go. American soldiers loaded trucks with grim efficiency, and Ellis went looking for Chaplain Whitmore. He found the chaplain in the makeshift chapel, conducting a service for a handful of soldiers. Ellis waited until it concluded, until the men filed out, then approached. "Chaplain, I need to talk to you." Whitmore looked at him and seemed to understand immediately. "This is about the German nurse." "Yes, sir. You want to marry her." "I want to save her life, sir. And yes, I want to marry her." The chaplain sat down heavily in one of the small chairs that had once been used by schoolchildren. "You understand what you're risking? This isn't a small infraction, Sergeant. This is a career-ending decision, potentially a freedom-ending decision." "I understand, sir." "And you're willing to face that? Court-martial, imprisonment, disgrace? For a woman you've known for a few weeks?" Ellis met his eyes. "Sir, I've killed men I didn't know at all because I was ordered to. Seems to me that saving a woman I care about is a better reason to risk everything." Whitmore was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I've been praying for guidance on this, asking God what he would want me to do, and I keep coming back to the same answer. Sometimes the law and what's right are not the same thing. Sometimes a man has to choose between following orders and following his conscience." "So you'll do it?" "I'll do it," Whitmore said. "But we have to be smart about this. The ceremony has to be real, legally binding so that the documentation can't be easily dismissed. But we also have to be careful. If Captain Dunbar finds out before we leave, he'll have no choice but to arrest you." They spent the day planning. Private Leland Ashford, Ellis's closest friend in the unit, was brought into the conspiracy. Lee was 22 from Tennessee, with a quick smile and an unshakable loyalty to the men he served with. When Ellis explained the situation, Lee didn't hesitate. "You need a witness, you've got one. You need someone to run interference with the captain, I'm your man. You need someone to hide her in a truck, I'll find the space." Ellis found Liesel at the hospital in the late afternoon. She was in the supply room taking inventory with the desperate focus of someone trying not to think about the future. He touched her shoulder gently. "Tonight," he said quietly. "Can you be ready?" She turned, eyes wide. "You're serious? You'll really do this?" "I'm serious. But Liesel, you need to understand what this means. We'll be married, truly married, not just on paper. I'm not doing this as a favor or a trick. If we do this, you're my wife, and I'll be your husband. For real." She searched his face, looking for doubt or hesitation. Finding none, she nodded. "I understand. And Ellis, thank you for seeing me as a person worth saving." "You're more than worth saving," he said. "You're worth everything." The plan was set for the early hours of July 1st. The convoy was scheduled to depart at 0600. The ceremony would take place at 0430, giving them just enough time to complete the paperwork and get Liesel hidden in one of the trucks before the official departure. June 30th passed in agonizing slowness. Ellis went through his duties mechanically, checking equipment, confirming orders, all while his mind raced through everything that could go wrong. Captain Dunbar was everywhere, inspecting preparations, ensuring every detail met his exacting standards. The man missed nothing, and Ellis felt certain that somehow the captain would discover the plan and stop it. As evening fell, the town took on a surreal quality. American soldiers sat in small groups, smoking, talking quietly, avoiding eye contact with the German civilians who watched them with desperate hope. Everyone knew what was coming. Everyone understood the betrayal that was about to occur, and no one had the power to stop it. At 2200 hours, Ellis, Lee, and Chaplain Whitmore met in the chapel. They went over the plan one final time. Lee would stand watch, ensuring no one interrupted. Whitmore would conduct the ceremony and prepare the documentation. Ellis would bring Liesel at 0415, giving them 15 minutes to complete everything before the convoy's final preparations began. "One more thing," Whitmore said, pulling out a marriage certificate form. "We need to be careful with the dates. If this shows today's date, it will be obvious what we did. I'm going to backdate it 2 weeks, make it look like the paperwork was in process before the withdrawal order came through. It's not perfect, but it might provide some cover if anyone questions it." Ellis nodded, understanding the risk the chaplain was taking. Falsifying military documents was itself a serious offense. Whitmore wasn't just enabling this marriage, he was fully complicit in it. The hours crawled past midnight. Ellis lay in his bunk, fully dressed, watching the luminous hands of his watch creep toward 0400. Around him, other soldiers slept, or pretended to, each dealing with the moral weight of the coming day in their own way. At 0345, Ellis rose silently and slipped out of the building. The town was dark, under strict blackout conditions even though the war was over. He moved through shadows, every sense alert for patrols or officers who might question why he was out of quarters. He reached the hospital at 0400. Liesl was waiting by the side entrance, dressed in the only civilian clothes she owned, a simple dark dress that had seen better days. She carried a small bag, everything she owned in the world reduced to what could fit in one piece of luggage. "Ready?" he whispered. She took his hand. "Ready." They moved through the sleeping town like ghosts. Once they had to press into a doorway as a patrol passed, but the soldiers were focused on the perimeter, not on the interior streets. They reached the chapel at 0412. Inside, Whitmore and Lee waited. The chaplain had lit 2 candles, their flickering light casting long shadows on the walls. It was perhaps the strangest wedding chapel imaginable, a former schoolroom in a conquered town in the hours before an army's retreat, with a ceremony that could destroy everyone involved. Whitmore opened his Bible. "We don't have time for the full service," he said quietly. "But I'll be damned if I'm going to make this anything less than sacred. What we're doing here is real, and it matters." He began to speak, his voice low but firm, the ancient words of the marriage ceremony given weight by the desperate circumstances. Ellis held Liesl's hands and made his vows, promising to love and cherish, to protect and honor, meaning every word with an intensity he had never felt before. Liesl repeated her own vows, her voice shaking but clear, binding herself to this American soldier who was risking everything for her. "By the power vested in me as a chaplain of the United States Army, and more importantly by the grace of God, I pronounce you husband and wife." Whitmore closed his Bible. "God help us all, but I believe this is right." Lee stepped forward with the marriage certificate. Whitmore had already filled in most of the information, including the backdated ceremony date. Ellis and Liesl signed. Lee signed as witness. Whitmore added his signature and seal. "It's done," the chaplain said, handing the document to Ellis. "Now get her out of here." They left the chapel at 0437. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten, the first hints of dawn touching the horizon. They had less than an hour and a half before the convoy's departure. Lee led them to the motor pool, where trucks sat in neat rows, already loaded and ready. He had prepared a space in one of the supply trucks, behind crates of equipment where Liesl could hide during the initial departure. Once they were safely away from the town and the Soviet lines, she could emerge and travel openly as a war bride. "This one," Lee said, pointing to a truck in the middle of the convoy. "Driver's name is Kowalski. He's solid. I told him we might have some irregular cargo and he didn't ask questions." Ellis helped Liesl climb into the back of the truck. The space Lee had prepared was cramped but concealed. She would have to stay hidden for perhaps an hour, maybe 2, until they were well into the American zone. "I'll be in the truck 3 vehicles behind you," Ellis told her. "When we stop, I'll come find you. Just stay quiet until then." She gripped his hand. "Ellis, if they find me, if something goes wrong, I want you to know that I'm grateful. Even if this doesn't work, you gave me hope when I had none." "It's going to work," he said with more confidence than he felt. "I'll see you in a few hours, Mrs. Thatcher." She smiled at the name, and then he was closing the canvas cover, hiding her from view. The next hour was the longest of Ellis's life. He returned to his unit's assembly area, where soldiers were conducting final checks and preparing to board vehicles. Captain Dunbar was everywhere, clipboard in hand, verifying every detail. Ellis forced himself to appear calm, to go through the motions of preparation, all while his heart hammered in his chest. At 0530, Dunbar called the unit to attention. "Gentlemen, in 30 minutes, we will depart this position and return to American-controlled territory. I know many of you have concerns about the people we're leaving behind. I share those concerns, but we are soldiers and we follow orders. Our duty is clear, and we will execute it with professionalism and discipline. Mount up." Soldiers climbed into trucks and jeeps. Engines rumbled to life, filling the pre-dawn air with noise and exhaust. Ellis took his position in his assigned vehicle, sitting among other members of his squad, all silent and grim-faced. At 05:55, the convoy began to move. They rolled through the town streets as dawn broke fully. German civilians lined the roads, watching in silence. Some wept openly. Others simply stared with hollow eyes, already resigned to what was coming. Ellis saw an old woman holding a young girl, perhaps her granddaughter, both of their faces frozen in expressions of terror and despair. The convoy reached the town's outskirts at 06:03. Ahead, Ellis could see the demarcation line, marked by signs in English and Russian. And beyond it, the first Soviet soldiers, waiting to take possession of their newly acquired territory. The American vehicles didn't stop. They crossed the line in a steady stream, leaving the Soviet zone behind. Ellis looked back once and saw Red Army trucks beginning to move forward, heading into the town his unit had just abandoned. He thought of the women and children still there, and felt a wave of shame and anger that no amount of following orders could wash away. But he also thought of Liesel, hidden in a truck now safely in American-controlled territory, and felt something else: hope, defiance, the knowledge that even in the midst of overwhelming darkness, one person could make a choice that mattered. The convoy traveled for 2 hours before making its first stop, a designated rest area where soldiers could stretch their legs and vehicles could be checked. Ellis waited impatiently until Captain Dunbar dismissed them for a 15-minute break, then immediately headed for the supply truck where Liesel was hidden. Private Kowalski, the driver, gave him a knowing nod. "Your package is secure, Sergeant." Quiet as a mouse the whole trip, Ellis climbed into the back of the truck and moved the crates aside. Liesel emerged from her hiding place, cramped and uncomfortable but safe. Her eyes were wet with tears. "We made it?" she asked. "We made it. You're in the American zone. You're safe." She collapsed against him, sobbing with relief and exhaustion. Ellis held her, aware that soldiers were walking past the truck, that at any moment someone could look inside and see them. But for that moment, he didn't care. They had done it. Against regulations, against orders, against all probability, they had saved her. Of course, their problems were far from over. Ellis still had to report the marriage to his superiors, still had to face whatever consequences came from his actions. But those were future concerns. For now, in the morning light of a German summer, holding his wife in his arms, Ellis Thatcher felt something he hadn't experienced in years of war. He felt like he had won. The convoy continued west, eventually reaching the American headquarters in Frankfurt. There, the reality of what Ellis had done began to catch up with him. He reported to Captain Dunbar with the marriage certificate, prepared for immediate arrest. Dunbar read the document in silence, his face unreadable. Finally, he looked up at Ellis. "This is dated 2 weeks ago." "Yes, sir." "The paperwork for approval isn't in any of my files." "No, sir." "Which means either it was lost in the chaos of the withdrawal, or this is backdated and you conducted an unauthorized marriage in the hours before we left." Ellis said nothing, meeting his captain's eyes. Dunbar was quiet for a long moment. Then he signed the document and handed it back. "Sergeant Thatcher, you're a damn fool. You've risked your career and your freedom for a woman you barely know. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be for me to bring you up on charges right now." "Yes, sir. But I'm not going to do that. Because the truth is, I'm tired of doing the smart thing and the safe thing, when those things mean abandoning innocent people to horror. Your marriage certificate is dated before the withdrawal order. As far as I'm concerned, the approval paperwork was lost in transit. Your wife is now a war bride with all appropriate status. Dismissed." Ellis stared at him in shock. "Sir, I—" "Dismissed, Sergeant. And Thatcher, take care of her. She's lucky to have someone willing to risk everything for her. Make sure she knows that every day." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." Ellis walked out of the office in a daze. He had prepared himself for court-martial, for disgrace, for the destruction of everything he had worked for. Instead, he had been given a gift he didn't deserve: a future. He found Liesel in the temporary housing area for displaced persons and war brides, sitting on a cot and looking lost in the chaos of the processing center. When she saw him, she stood quickly, searching his face for news. "We're clear," he said. "The captain approved it. You're officially my wife, and you're officially under American protection." She sat back down, as if her legs could no longer support her. "It's really over? We're safe? We're safe," he confirmed, sitting beside her and taking her hand. "Now we just have to figure out the rest of our lives." The rest of their lives began with paperwork, Mountains of it. Liesl had to be processed as a war bride, which meant background checks, medical examinations, interviews, and endless forms. Ellis had to navigate the military bureaucracy, ensuring that every piece of documentation was in order, that no one looked too closely at the timeline of their marriage. It took 3 months before Liesl was cleared to travel to the United States. 3 months of living in displaced persons camps, of Ellis visiting whenever his duties allowed, of slowly building a relationship that had begun in desperation and crisis. They learned about each other in the aftermath of their dramatic beginning. Liesl discovered that Ellis was quiet and thoughtful, more comfortable showing love through actions than words. Ellis learned that Liesl had a dry sense of humor that emerged when she felt safe, and a strength that went far beyond physical courage. In October 1945, Liesl boarded a ship bound for New York, one of the first war brides to make the journey. Ellis, discharged from the army now that the war was over, traveled with her. They stood on the deck as the ship pulled away from Europe, watching the continent recede into the distance. "Do you regret it?" Liesl asked quietly. "Giving up everything you knew for me?" Ellis thought about Iowa, about the farm and his family, and the life he had planned. Then he looked at the woman beside him, the nurse who had chosen compassion over hatred, who had worked to heal rather than destroy, and he shook his head. "No regrets," he said. "Not one." They arrived in New York on a gray November day. Ellis's parents met them at the dock, having traveled from Iowa to welcome their new daughter-in-law. Ellis had written to them explaining the situation, though he had left out certain details about the circumstances of the marriage. He had been prepared for anger, for disappointment, for rejection. Instead, his mother took one look at Liesl, thin and exhausted from the journey, and pulled her into a tight embrace. "Welcome home, dear," she said simply. "Welcome home." They settled in Iowa on a small farm adjacent to his parents' property. Ellis used his military savings to buy the land, and together he and Liesl built a life from the ashes of war. It wasn't easy. Liesl faced suspicion and hostility from some in the community, who couldn't forgive her German heritage. There were whispered comments, cold shoulders, doors that remained closed to her, but there were also kindnesses. Neighbors who brought food when they learned Liesl was pregnant with their first child. The local doctor who treated her with the same respect he showed any patient. The gradual acceptance that came as people saw her dedication to her new community, her volunteer work at the local hospital, her quiet determination to build bridges rather than walls. Their first child, a daughter they named Anna, was born in August 1946. She was followed by 2 more children, a son named Robert in 1948 and another daughter Margaret in 1951. Ellis worked the farm and took odd jobs in town. Liesl worked as a nurse at the county hospital, her skills and compassion making her indispensable despite her accent and her past. The years passed. The children grew. The farm prospered. Ellis and Liesl grew old together, their marriage built on a foundation of mutual respect and the knowledge that they had chosen each other when the choice mattered most. Ellis died in 1998, at the age of 81, of heart failure. Liesl held his hand as he passed, whispering to him in German, the language of her childhood, telling him that she loved him, that she was grateful for every day they had shared. Liesl lived another 7 years, passing away in 2005 at the age of 84. In her final days, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, she spoke often of that night in July 1945, of the American sergeant who had risked everything to save her. It was while sorting through their grandmother's belongings that Anna's children, cleaning out the old farmhouse, found the documents. The marriage certificate, carefully preserved in a frame, with its date of June 15, 1945, but also a letter, written in Ellis's handwriting, sealed and marked, "To be opened after we're both gone." The family gathered in the farmhouse's living room as Anna, now in her 50s, opened the letter and read it aloud. "To our children and grandchildren," Ellis had written. "If you're reading this, then Liesl and I have both passed on, and you're probably going through our things and wondering about the stories we told and the ones we didn't. There's something you should know about how your grandmother and I came to be married. Something we never spoke about publicly because it involved breaking rules and taking risks that seemed crazy to anyone who wasn't there. The date on our marriage certificate is a lie. We weren't married on June 15, 1945. We were married on July 1st at 4:30 in the morning in a ceremony conducted in secret because I was violating direct orders and military law to save the woman I loved from being left behind when the Americans withdrew from the Soviet zone. I want you to understand why I did it, not to justify myself or to make excuses, but because I think it's important that you know what your grandmother was worth. She was worth my career. She was worth my freedom. She was worth every risk I took and every consequence I was willing to face. Liesl Brenner was the finest person I ever knew. In the midst of the worst humanity had to offer, she chose to heal. She chose to see people, not enemies. She chose compassion, when hatred would have been easier and more justified. And when I had the chance to save her, there was no choice at all. I would have done anything, risked anything to make sure she survived. The chaplain who married us, Amos Whitmore, used to say that sometimes the law and what's right are not the same thing. I believe that. I believe that there are moments when a person has to choose between following rules and following their conscience. That night in Germany, I chose my conscience. I chose love. I chose life. I never regretted it. Not for one single day. Every moment I spent with your grandmother, every child we raised, every sunrise we watched together on this farm, all of it was possible because I made that choice. And I would make it again, 1,000 times over. So when you think about us, don't just remember the stories we told about meeting in a hospital or falling in love during the occupation. Remember that love sometimes requires courage, that doing the right thing sometimes means breaking the rules, that saving one person might not change the world, but it changes everything for that person. Your grandmother gave me a life worth living. I hope I gave her the same. And I hope that all of you, our descendants, will carry forward the lesson we learned in those desperate days. That in the darkest times, the most important thing you can do is choose love over fear, compassion over hatred, and action over indifference. We love you all. Take care of each other. Ellsworth Thatcher, written in 1997. The room was silent when Anna finished reading. Then someone asked about Chaplain Whitmore, and Anna produced another document from the collection. It was a newspaper obituary from 1989. Reverend Amos Whitmore died peacefully at age 95. Veteran of World War II, served as military chaplain. After the war, he became a pastor in Ohio, known for his advocacy for refugees and displaced persons. He never married, dedicating his life to service. He is remembered by many whose lives he touched, including several war brides whom he helped in the chaotic final days of the European conflict. Another piece of the puzzle. The chaplain who had risked his own career to conduct that secret ceremony had spent the rest of his life helping others in similar desperate circumstances. He had turned one act of conscience into a lifetime of compassion. The family spent hours going through the documents, piecing together the full story. They found letters between Ellis and his parents, carefully worded to avoid explicitly mentioning the illegal nature of the marriage. They found Liesl's original German identification papers, stamped with the occupation authorities' seals. They found photographs of the two of them in those early years, young and uncertain, building a life from nothing. And they found one more thing, a small notebook in Liesl's handwriting, written in German. Anna's daughter, who had studied the language in college, translated it. It was a diary, kept sporadically over the years, recording Liesl's thoughts and memories. One entry, dated July 1st, 1975, the 30th anniversary of their marriage, read, 30 years ago today, a man I barely knew saved my life by risking his own future. I have spent every day since trying to be worthy of that sacrifice. Ellis says I don't need to prove anything, that loving him is enough. But I want our children to understand what their father did, what it meant to stand up against injustice even when the cost was high. I want them to know that their existence is the result of courage and compassion, that they come from a love that defied armies and laws and common sense. I want them to be proud of the choice their father made, and to make similar choices when their own moments come. The family sat together in that farmhouse, 3 generations connected by a decision made in the pre-dawn darkness of a German town 70 years earlier. They understood now, in a way they never had before, the weight of what their grandparents had done. The risks taken, the rules broken, the future gambled on one desperate act of love. Anna looked at the marriage certificate, with its false date, and its very real consequences. They never told us, she said quietly. All these years and they never said a word about how it really happened. They were protecting us, her brother Robert said. If anyone had investigated, if the truth had come out, There could have been legal consequences even years later. Falsifying military documents, unauthorized marriage, it was all technically criminal. They kept the secret to keep us safe, and to keep the focus on what mattered, Margaret added. Not the drama of how they got married, but the life they built after. The family they created, the love they shared. They decided after much discussion to donate the documents to a historical society specializing in World War II history. The story of Ellis and Liesl Thatcher became part of the historical record, one small example of the countless personal dramas that played out in the chaos of war's end. Historians noted it as an illustration of the complex moral situations faced by occupation forces, the desperation of German civilians in the Soviet zone, and the human cost of political decisions made far from the front lines. But for the Thatcher family, it was more than history. It was the foundation of their existence. Every family gathering, every holiday, every moment of connection between them existed because one man had looked at a desperate woman and said, "I'll risk everything for you." Years later, Anna's granddaughter, researching the family history for a school project, asked her great-aunt Margaret what she thought the story meant. Margaret, now elderly herself, considered the question carefully. "I think it means that love is a choice," she said finally. "Not just the feeling, but the decision to act on it even when it's dangerous or difficult." Grandpa Ellis could have felt sorry for Grandma Liesl and done nothing. He could have followed orders and left her behind. But he chose to act. He chose to risk everything because he believed she was worth it. "Was she?" the girl asked. "Worth all that risk?" Margaret smiled. "Look around you. Look at this family, all of us here because of that choice. Look at the lives Grandma Liesl saved as a nurse, the people she helped, the difference she made. Look at the example they set for all of us about courage and compassion. Was she worth it? She was worth everything. And I think Grandpa Ellis knew that from the moment he met her. The story of Sergeant Ellsworth Thatcher and Nurse Liesl Brenner is not unique. In the chaos of World War II's end, countless similar dramas played out. Soldiers who risked careers to save civilians. Chaplains who bent rules to conduct marriages. Officers who looked the other way when their men broke regulations for the right reasons. Most of these stories were never recorded, never preserved, lost to time, and the participants' desire for privacy. But the ones we know about, the ones that survived in letters and documents and family memories, they matter. They remind us that even in the midst of overwhelming darkness, individuals can make choices that affirm life and love. That sometimes the most heroic act is not following orders, but defying them for the sake of conscience. That courage comes in many forms, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is risk everything for one person who needs you. Ellis and Liesl Thatcher lived ordinary lives after their extraordinary beginning. They raised children, worked hard, paid their taxes, attended church, and participated in their community. They never sought recognition for what they had done, never told their story publicly, never claimed to be heroes. But they were. In the most important way, they were heroes. Not because they fought battles or led armies, but because when faced with an impossible choice, they chose love. They chose life. They chose to believe that one person saving one other person mattered, even if it didn't change the world. And in the end, maybe that's what heroism really is. Not grand gestures or famous deeds, but quiet acts of courage performed by ordinary people who refuse to accept that compassion is impossible or that following your conscience is foolish. It's the soldier who risks court-martial to save a woman's life. It's the chaplain who falsifies documents because his faith demands justice. It's the captain who looks the other way because he knows the difference between law and morality. It's a nurse and a sergeant, standing in a makeshift chapel at 4:30 in the morning, making vows they intend to keep, choosing each other when the world said they shouldn't, building a life from the ashes of war. Their story ended in an Iowa farmhouse surrounded by the family they created, the legacy of a choice made in darkness and desperation. But the meaning of that story continues, passed down through generations, a reminder that love is worth fighting for, that courage matters, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is risk everything to save one person who needs you. If you found this story as powerful as we did, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories from history. Hit that like button and leave a comment telling us what you think about Ellis and Liesl's courageous choice. What would you have done in their situation? We'd love to hear from you.